Alright, in this video we're going to explore the beginnings of the Parousia, or the presence or the coming of the Lord, by reviewing some of the prophesied indications of the timing of the judgment that was to befall Israel. They're connected. If we can begin to narrow down the time frame of the occurrence of those events, it'll help us better understand the context of the judgment prophecies of Yeshua. You know, when I first started doing this, my daughter saw this first slide and she's like, "Man, that looks really intense with all the fire and the flames and everything." And I'm like, yeah, judgment from God is kind of an intense thing. Alright, well, let's take a look at what's going on. So the final words of the Old Testament come to us from the last chronological prophet of that era, who was Malachi. Now, Malachi preached about 400 years prior to the birth of the Messiah. And to put that in perspective for us, that would be the equivalent of a prophet living around the time of the production of the King James Bible in 1611, pronouncing judgment on us today. And from that time until the present, there would have been no intervening prophetic word. All would have been silent until the prophecies began to come to pass. James Stuart Russell writes, "None of the prophets is the bearer of a heavier burden than the last. Malachi is the prophet of doom. It would seem that the nation, by its incorrigible obstinacy and disobedience, had forfeited the divine favor and proved itself not only unworthy, but incapable of the promised glories." The departure of the prophetic spirit was full of evil omen, and seemed to intimate that the Lord was about to forsake the land. Accordingly, the light of Old Testament prophecy goes out amidst clouds and thick darkness. Now, as we study the closing pages of the Old Testament, we're faced with judgment prophecies of Malachi that are pronounced on the nation of Israel. God indicts Israel, not the world, on a long list of charges, including sacrilege, hypocrisy, contempt of God, blasphemy, apostasy, to name a few. Yet in spite of these clear evidences, many times over, the people stubbornly maintained their innocence. God then, in his justice, has no choice but to pronounce certain judgment through Malachi, as we shall see. Malachi 3:5, he says, "I will come near to you in judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, and against the adulterers, and against those false swearers, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, and that turn aside the stranger from his right, and fear not me, saith the Lord of hosts." Same thing in chapter 4, verse 1. "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. And the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch." Everything prophesied here points to an approaching catastrophe in the history of the nation, when God would inflict severe judgment upon his rebellious people. So the question then becomes, if the sentence had been passed and the decision made, when would this national judgment happen? Well, we gain a couple of clues in what Malachi prophesies. He identifies this time of judgment as, quote, "the day." He calls it the day that shall burn as an oven in chapter 4, verse 1. The prophet Joel had previously predicted the great and terrible day of the Lord in Joel 2:31, a phrase which Malachi repeats in chapter 4, verse 5. Further, Malachi becomes even more precise about the timing of this day when he proclaims in chapter 4, verse 5, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord." And this tells us that one like Elijah would appear prior to this day of judgment. This is very helpful in narrowing the time frame down for us, because we know that Yeshua himself declared in no uncertain terms that John the Baptizer was this prophesied Elijah. In Matthew 11, verses 13 and 14, Yeshua himself says, "For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John the Baptizer. And if you're willing to accept it, John himself is Elijah who was to come." Therefore, the great and terrible day of the Lord that Malachi predicts must occur within a specific time frame shortly after John the Baptizer's ministry. Further, there's also a correlation in Malachi 3:2 with a reference in the book of Revelation. So let's take a look at that. In Malachi 3, verses 1 and 2, Malachi says, "Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap." And a correlation in Revelation 6, verses 16 and 17 says, "And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come." There's the day again. "And who is able to stand?" Notice it's the same thing that was spoken about in Malachi 3. This correlation of who will be able to stand on this awful day draws these prophecies toward the same event, the coming of the Lord. Additionally, you can see in Malachi 3:1, he is said to be coming suddenly to his temple. Now, while some have posed that this coming to his temple is when Yeshua was presented at the temple shortly after his birth, that doesn't seem to fit with the second verse, where it is asked who can endure or who can stand. This is much more fitting for the time of the ruin of the temple, when it came suddenly upon the population gathered for the feast of Passover. So let's take a look at some of the similar language and imagery in all of these various passages relating to the day of the Lord. Malachi 3:2, "Who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears?" Matthew 23:38, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." 1 Peter 4:17, "For the time is come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of God?" 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 2 and 3, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape." Malachi 3:1, "And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple." Malachi 3:2, "But who can endure the day of his coming? For he is like a refiner's fire." Malachi 4:1, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble. And the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch." Malachi 4:5, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord." Well, certainly then, the timing of the judgment of the Jewish nation on the day of his coming was when their city and temple were destroyed, and the entire fabric of their religious system was dissolved. Russell again writes the following: "It's important to observe that this has a distinct and specific reference to the land of Israel. The message of the prophet is to Israel. The sins which are reprobated are the sins of Israel. The coming of the Lord is to his temple in Israel. The land threatened with the curse is the land of Israel." All of this manifestly points to a specific local and national catastrophe of which the land of Israel was to be the scene and its guilty inhabitants the victims. History records the fulfillment of the prophecy in exact correspondence of time, place, and circumstance in the ruin which overwhelmed the Jewish nation at the period of the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, while all this death and destruction can be disturbing to review, we must remember that this was the penalty that God had pronounced through Moses 1,000 years earlier, when he warned them what would come upon them if they disobeyed. You can read about it in Deuteronomy 28, verses 15 through 68. It's most of that chapter. But here are a couple of excerpts. Deuteronomy 28:15, "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And they agreed to accept those terms. When they didn't perform, God, as a good father, had no choice but to follow through. And even as they are suspended in this judgment, He yet provides opportunity for release from this penalty by sending His Son, Yeshua the Messiah, to redeem them and to restore them in grace and mercy through the gospel message. A message that I believe is still valid for anyone who chooses today to place their faith in the Messiah. Well, I hope this video provided some insights that maybe you haven't seen before. And I do want to take this time to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this and learn along with me. Take care, and we'll see you next time.